Good evening and welcome. How's the sound tonight? Can you hear me okay? The front can hear me. Can anyone in the back hear me? Would the front tell the back whether it's worth hearing me? Can you hear me now? Okay. What's much more important is whether you can hear Graham and Jeff's lavalier mics in just a moment. My name is David Bradley. I'm with The Atlantic. We're really happy to have you here. We're really happy to have our guest of honor, Graham Allison, professor at the Kennedy School, with us this evening. For me, it goes beyond happy. This is joyous. I have loved this man as long as I have known him. You'll get immediately where I'm going with this, but most of us live very quiet lives and never have an accomplishment that breaks us into public view. Some people have that one moment when they crest up into the public recognition. I always think of this as Charles Lindbergh, who had one great accomplishment and then everything was kind of sad after that. And then almost no one survives decade after decade in the public eye. Graham Allison, age 77, is in his fifth decade in the public eye. Next year he will have been a Harvard professor for 50 years. He was first public, I think, for most of us, in 1971 with The Essence of Decision. How many studied Essence of Decision or read The Essence? It's extraordinary. And the Atlantic audience is a perfect representation of the American public as a whole. So let me just prove that. How many of you voted for Donald Trump? Okay, well, on some things. And then we have Jeff Goldberg. Jeff is one of those people whose only moment of breaking into the public eye is when I rescued him from obscurity a little while ago and made him the editor of The Atlantic. Some of you don't know Jeff's writing, but you'll recognize something that he and I co-authored together last year, The Obama Doctrine. It's a very successful article. This is Jeff's first time in front of a live audience, so I hope you will be supportive of him and Professor Graham Allison.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it, I think. And thank you for hosting this event. Thank you all for coming. We'll jump right in, Graham, if that's okay with you. I would note only that, and this is not, and I usually don't butter up the guest, but this is a fairly profound book, and I hope that all of you read the whole thing. It reads as a somewhat dystopian, marginally hopeful guide to our future. But it's not. I mean, it's not that depressing. But it's really profound. I don't want to say it's your best book because I'm sure your books are like children. You know, you don't want to say you love one more than the other. But this is a really extraordinary book. I would also note I'm not biased, but this book started as an article in The Atlantic, so in fact I am biased in saying that it's his best work. All of your books should have started in The Atlantic. They would have been much better. Before we talk about Thucydides and China, let me ask a question that is very much related to the themes about the future of American power and the role of China in the world. The decision today to pull out of the Paris Accord. Without being overly dramatic, let me ask you two related questions. The first is, does this mark the end of America's role as global leader? And the second question is, how do you think China will take advantage of this, by my lights, self-isolating act on the part of the Trump administration?
So two great questions. Let me say just a word before
Yeah, go ahead.
to say how honored and pleased I am to be here, how much I appreciate David Bradley, who I've been a great admirer of forever, and I think the rescue and revival of The Atlantic is a fantastic undertaking that I talked to him about it when he was attempting to do it. If I had been an investor, I think I would have been a little skittish. thinking that it was too hard to do, and I think what's been accomplished is just nothing short of stunning. And so to have a serious journal like The Atlantic, 150 years old, surviving in this highly competitive environment is not just for David, but for you and for the team that does it. I think for a reader and for a writer, I think it's great for us. And secondly, I think having Jeff as the editor is a fantastic idea. That was a great coup. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of the interview and discussion and talk about the book. So I think if you were just an adult looking at the world and you see the decision today, you would say in a word that this is just dumb. Yeah. And then you could...
The sum total of 50 years at Harvard has led him to this conclusion.
You could elaborate, but I think that...
Standing on one foot.
Yes. So the fact is that almost all leaders of almost all countries and almost all scientists and almost all intelligent people recognize that human beings are putting up greenhouse gases that are affecting the climate in such a way that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, we could actually have an uninhabitable climate. So in the Commission of American for American National Interest, which I co-chaired back in 1996, we were very tight in the argument about what constitute vital American interests. In Washington, vital just means I care a lot about it, call it vital. We say that Washington's promiscuous in the use of vital. We say vital is only what the dictionary says, essential for survival. Okay? But if for whatever reason some course of action produced an environment that you couldn't live in, that's called an existential threat to a country, to your vital interests. So we put it as a vital interest to have a survivable environment in which people could live. And Paris was only a step in this direction, but it did represent a huge agreement between the US and China, the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, and a global consensus to recognize the problem, to start taking actions, and even to start on the road. And in fact, it also included not just the Paris Accord, the first portion of it, but secondly, a huge investment venture that Bill Gates sort of put $1 billion into, but 15 other billionaires put money into, and governments into, to try to change the technologies that would allow us to have electricity and energy as we use it without ruining the environment. So the notion that the country that had played this essential role in developing this consensus has for some moment awakened or whatever, and decides we'll just walk away from this is, I think, in the big picture, mad. I mean, genuinely mad. And you would say, you don't, especially in an international environment in which, as in this case, as I argue in the book, where you have a Thucydidean dynamic, a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power, where the ruling power has played a leadership role in something that matters to everybody else in the world and got them more or less into some consensus. And they have a plan of action, and they're beginning to act on it, to say adios, and leave it to, and I think if
so
you
what specifically did the Chinese do now?
I think the Chinese, Xi Jinping broke out the champagne yesterday when he was pretty clear how the decision was going to come down. And as one has seen in multiple other arenas, including Davos in January, where it was a very vivid, almost iconic case, where his Xi Jinping by then Trump was already trashing TPP and the Paris Accord. Here Xi Jinping represents the leader who's globally praised by every other leader for being the paragon of free trade. Excuse me, China is not a paragon of free trade. China has the most mercantilist trade system in the world. So the notion that everybody else is saying, great, Mr. Xi Jinping for trade, and ditto with respect to climate. I would say in the climate thing, even as best I can understand from the Paris Accord, you have commitments, but you have a lot of fuzz with respect to enforcement and to compliance. And so I myself have great doubts about whether the Chinese are counting correctly what they're actually accomplishing. But nonetheless, if you exit the stage, you know, then I look like the leader.
Right. But go to this question of tipping point. I mean, we in journalism sometimes the last few months we get a little bit overheated and describe a particular Trump decision as the death knell of democracy, the death knell of American global leadership. The question is, is this the point where you think, or do you want to wait 20 or 30 years to decide whether this is the moment, or does this feel different to you in terms of the way America is going to be perceived in the world as a stable, mature leader?
That's an extremely difficult question. So I would say you have initially, I mean, I start off as a very realist analyst of international politics. So I start with the underlying structural forces and the balance of power or correlation of forces. So as I argue in the book, the basic fact, the main axis that's been happening over our professional careers and looking forward is that a country that did not even appear on any of the international league tables when Ronald Reagan became president,
right,
less than 10% the size of the U.S., in 2014 became as large as we are as an economy, and by 2024 maybe half again larger on the current trend lines measured by purchasing power parity, which is the best single metric. So you look and you say, whoa, wait a minute. How can somebody come from nowhere to be equal and maybe even rivaling in such a short period of time? And as I argue in the book, taking a line from former Czech President Havel, this has all happened so fast, most of us haven't had time to be astonished. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's genuinely unbelievable. I put a chart in the book that I use for my class at Harvard, and which I have 26 indicators, and it says, when could China become number one? Number one automaker, number one cell phone producer, number one artificial intelligence, number one supercomputer. 26 indicators. Students say, well, maybe 2040, maybe 2050, not in my lifetime. Then I have a second chart, and it says already. Okay? It gives the dates, already. So basically, that's the underlying. Now, if in that situation, a state which has a leadership role because it's been putting together the structures that include many other parties, other powerful parties who are part of the framework that we call the international order, the stability in the order. So here's Germany. Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world. Germany is a serious player. So if Mrs. Merkel, when she wakes up, think, Donald Trump makes no sense to me. The president of the U.S. is doing things that are harmful for everybody. And climate and trade are two things that touch every citizen. Most citizens can understand what's happening in the climate space. All citizens worry about their own economic situation. So walking away from TPP, which we had spent a lot of time invested in, and which many, many other leaders like Abe had paid a price already politically at home to get the thing ratified. Now we walk away and he's left there having paid the price and not having the agreement. So I predict the Chinese will come in with a trade agreement in the region. It'll be a much lower agreement, but nonetheless it'll be China rules. And I think in the environmental space, if we're not there, there'll be also China rules. And if I were the Chinese, and certainly the way they behave, they will write the rules in such a way that they're very good for them, extremely good for them, and not as good for us. Yeah.
So we're going to go full dystopian this evening, obviously. But why don't we, before we go back to China and the U.S. and the rivalry and where it might be headed, I want to step all the way back, and I want you to do three quick things. It's hard to do them quickly, but I'd ask you to try. The first is define the Thucydides trap, what you've discovered in the pattern of rising power meets dominant power. And the second and third things I'd like you to do is talk about an instance from history in which the rise of a power led to war with the dominant power, and then pick another example from history of in which that conflict was avoided despite the rise of a young, aggressive, growing power.
Okay, as usual.
And you can
as
do it
Jeff,
and do it.
Jeff says summarize the whole book in 3 minutes.
Yes,
So I'll try.
yes. Before we go to
I'll
commercial
try very
break,
quickly.
yes.
Okay, so Thucydides was the founder of history. He lived about 2,500 years ago. Absolutely brilliant. And indeed, if you want a freebie for tonight, go home. You can download the Peloponnesian War for free. Just read the first 100 pages, the first book on how we got the war. It is brilliant. It'll knock your socks off, absolutely. Every time I read it, I learn 6 more things, and I wonder, did I ever read it before? Or maybe I...
Or you can watch the
maybe
NBA final. You got a choice. It's a binary. Okay.
You can watch it. You can watch it after you see LeBron. Okay. So, what is Thucydides' trap? So Thucydides wrote about the conflict between the 2 great city-states in classical Greece, and his famous line says it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable. So Thucydides' trap is the inherent structural stress that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. And I think, and Henry Kissinger argues, or agrees or has said, that Thucydides' trap is the best lens available for looking beneath the noise and the news of the day of whether North Korea is testing missiles, or whether there's a near collision in the South China Sea, or whether China becomes the #1 trading partner with Germany, or whatever, to understand what's happening in this dynamic. When a rising power is rising, it thinks, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, my interests count more, I deserve a little more say and sway. This set of arrangements that I find myself in are confining. And the ruling power thinks, who is this upstart that's trying to displace the incumbent? I've created a circumstance in which it's even had an opportunity to grow up. And now it's ungrateful and wanting to make adjustments in things. And you can see this across history, and you can see this across companies. Look at Uber or Google or Apple and the taxi industry, or Microsoft, or look even in families, you can see this. You can see it in gorillas. If you have an alpha dominant gorilla, anywhere you have a dominance hierarchy, the alpha gorilla and a wannabe, you can watch this dynamic. And even think about it in families. So that's what's Thucydides' trap. So secondly, what the case where rise, and in this book,
ultimate case is Athens and Sparta, as you might
absolutely, and that's the case that Thucydides explains. It was the rise of Athens and the fear in Sparta. And he develops it in delicious detail and with lots and lots of fine nuance. Okay? I look in this book at the last 500 years, and I find 16 cases in which a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. In 12 of the cases, the outcome was war. In 4 of the cases, the outcome was not war. So I say Thucydides, if you read it in context, his inevitable was really, was hyperbole. He was exaggerating. He just meant very likely. So the case that's most like the current case and most troubling, I think, is the rise of Germany and its impact on Britain literally 100 and a few years ago. So Germany was unified in 1870 by Bismarck, putting together what had been German principalities. Germany at that time was about half the size of Britain's GDP. By 1900, Germany was about equal. By 1914, it was a quarter larger. So you had this soaring Germany. Britain, which had been the ruler of the world, and the sign was, the empire in which the sun never set, which was correct. It had a navy that ruled the waves everywhere, had a huge empire that included India and Canada and whatever. So the British, with their naval fleet, were feeling, who is this upstart and what is it doing? And why is it being threatening to us? And why is it actually building a navy bigger than our navy? Or trying to build a navy that threatens our navy. So you have this dynamic, just as Thucydides described it, between Athens and Sparta. And then what happens, and this is the normal Thucydidean thing, where you have a rising power syndrome and a ruling power syndrome, some external event, which would otherwise be inconsequential or manageable, triggers a cascade of actions and reactions, at the end of which things are catastrophic. So again, 1914, I don't believe you can study too much. I have a good chapter in the book on 1914, and I continue to read everything I can about 1914. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo by a Serbian terrorist, I mean, who could make this up if you were making a novel, okay, becomes the match that creates a fire that becomes a conflagration, at the end of which it's so devastating that historians have to invent a whole new category for describing it. That's why they call it World War, World War I. Okay, so at the end of this war, every one of the actors has lost what he cares about most. Absolutely. The Austro-Hungarian emperor, he's trying to keep together his empire. His empire's dissolved, he's gone. The Russian Tsar, he's trying to back up the Serbians. He's been overthrown by the Bolsheviks. The German Kaiser, he's ousted, okay? The French bled for a whole generation. France never recovers. And Britain, which used to be a creditor country, is now a debtor and is also in terminal decline. So everybody lost what he cared about most. If they had been given a chance for a do-over, nobody would have made the choices that he made. So nobody wanted a war. People made mistakes. One thing led to the other. And so that's a situation where I could imagine, God forbid, in the current situation, in North Korea, if for whatever reason, in fact, I can get the war between U.S. and China with a North Korean trigger easier than I can tell the story of 1914, which still makes no sense.
Right. Let me come to that in a minute, but let me ask you a question about one of the instances in which this trap did not lead to war, because it relates to one of the players that you just talked about, the displacement of Great Britain by the United States as the primary naval power, economic power, and then global power did not create a war between the United States and Britain. Britain gently moved off the stage and allowed the United States, didn't have much of a choice in allowing it, but it nevertheless allowed it to rise.
Adjusted, yeah.
Why did that happen, and does that inform anything about what might happen between China and the United States?
So absolutely. The four cases of no war, the two that are most instructive are the one you mentioned, the rise of the U.S., which looks a lot like the rise of Germany, actually, if you want. They're going on at about the same time. So at the end of the Civil War, again, the U.S. is about 60% the GDP of Britain. By 1900, we're 125%. By 1914, we're already 150%. So we're on an even faster slope. And the behavior of the U.S. towards Britain is a classic case of the rising power. I have a chapter on if Xi's China were just like us, and if
it's a brutal chapter. Well, brutally exciting. I meant
this is this is a chapter Americans will not like to read.
No. But do a parenthetical on this just for a minute, because you lead us to the question: how would the United States react today? Well, you start with Teddy Roosevelt, but you bring me to the question: how would the United States react today if the Chinese Navy was operating in the Caribbean the way the American Navy is operating in the South China Sea?
Absolutely.
And I think any reasonable analysis would say we wouldn't be overly thrilled by having the Chinese Navy doing what we're doing in the South China Sea.
All people who've worked for the American government have given the lecture many times, Rick Burt more than I have, that says to some foreigners, you should be more like us. We're responsible. Yeah. We take account of the global order. We have public goods, whatever. So I say if we ask the Chinese to be more like us win, okay? So how about when the U.S. was entering what it was supremely confident was going to become an American century? So let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century. So in this chapter, I try to watch it through the eyes of Teddy Roosevelt. So it's a long, complicated story, but I'll just give you the highlight from it. Here's a 37-year-old. Okay? He arrives in Washington in 1897 to become the #2 person in the Department of the Navy. For 20 years, he's already been ranting about the abomination, he calls it, of the Spanish being in Cuba. What are they doing in Cuba? That's right here in our lake, okay? And the British Navy, why do we always see them here? And the German Navy, what are they doing here? So what happens in the decade after Teddy Roosevelt arrives as the #2 person in the Navy? First, there's a mysterious explosion on a ship in Havana Harbor, which becomes the occasion for the U.S. to declare war on Spain. We defeat them, we liberate Cuba, we take Puerto Rico, we take Guam. Okay? Second, we want a canal for Teddy's Navy. Colombia will not give us a canal. We support and sponsor a coup in Colombia. We create a new country. It's called Panama. The next day, it gives us our contract for this canal. Third, Germany and Britain are both arguing with their ships about a territorial dispute in Venezuela. Teddy Roosevelt says, you have no interest in these matters. This is in our hemisphere. You're out of here or you're going to be fired upon by American ships, the British. Okay? Now, if we had gone to war with the Brits at that time, their Navy would still be able to have beaten us, but the Brits also had to worry about Germany, which is coming at the same time, and they also had to worry about India, where the Russians might take advantage of a situation because India was the jewel in their crown. In any case, he threatened war with both of them, and both of them backed off. And then finally, the one that I like the most is he stole most of the fat tail of Alaska. So if you haven't noticed, you should look at the map. There's Alaska, and then there's this 500-mile strip that cuts Canada off from the sea that goes down to Juneau. This came about by Mr. John Muir, who's the famous naturalist who did the Sierra Club and did Yosemite. So
Atlantic writer, by the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Noting for the
really?
record.
Okay.
Hasn't done much for us lately.
Well,
unlike Frederick Douglass.
Let me do one more aside. The most choice line from the weekend came from Peggy Noonan for me, where she's interviewing David McCullough, and he says he's been giving lectures at universities. So he's at one university lecturing, and somebody comes up and they say, "Mr. McCullough, this is the most brilliant historian I've ever seen. I've read all your books; they're so fascinating. Which presidents other than Truman and Adams have you interviewed?" So, in any case, Muir goes up there in his canoe. He's exploring glaciers, and he writes a travel log, which is a great travel log. But in any case, he writes back to Teddy Roosevelt, whom he knows he had him to come camping with him in Yosemite, which is the way that we got Yosemite Park. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt went camping there. He said, "This looks great." It was national forest or national park. But in any case, he writes back and he says, "This river here that I'm on, this, the Stickeen River, is like 100 Yosemites." And Teddy Roosevelt turns to his Secretary of State and he says, "That sounds like America." And the Secretary of State says, "No, sir, this is in Canada." And he says, "This cannot be in Canada. Look at this, it's 100 Yosemites." And so he threatens war with Canada to steal it, and we steal it. Okay? We didn't pay for it at all. I went fishing there last summer. It's the largest American national forest. It's called Tongass National Forest. You could go look it up on the map. Okay? And then he announces the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said, this is our hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary says, if any nation in our hemisphere misbehaves, in our view, we will send the Marines and change their government. And then every year thereafter, for the next 10 years, the Marines go somewhere and change some government. So if we could imagine a Xi Jinping, it wouldn't be Xi Jinping, it would be his successor, who looks and says, what the hell is the U.S. Navy doing in the South China Sea? This is on our border. This is our sea. And why are you the arbiter of whether there should be an island or whose territory this is or how this should be?
Does he have Roosevelt's impulses?
He does a little bit. And
does he have his capabilities?
Well,
he's developing.
He does. And Teddy Roosevelt, who's one of my heroes, Teddy Roosevelt is a wild character. Okay? Mark Twain said about him, he is, quote, certifiably insane. So he was not a unified view. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, if you want a wonderful read, the Edmund Morris first volume of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, I'm sorry, this is one more aside, but it's a fun story. He's the president, and the British ambassador comes, and they have to present their credentials. So the guy comes and presents his credentials to the president. The president says, it was a hot day in the summer, and he says, "Come on, let's get in a carriage and we'll go." This is the time there were carriages, not the cars. For those of you who don't know, remember, okay, this is back in the 4 or so. Let's go out to Rock Creek and go swimming. The British ambassador here has come in his nice clothes and whatever, so they go there and they arrive. Teddy Roosevelt strips off completely naked and jumps in Rock Creek. And the British ambassador is thinking, oh, Moses, what have I? So he properly takes off his clothes and folds them, goes into the water. This is our president. Okay, so I don't think Xi Jinping is up to that.
I don't want to give you another essay question because it will result in you assigning another reading for the audience.
Yeah.
But stay on this question of Xi Jinping. You write a lot about him. He is a powerful and determined figure who was forged in a. We don't have to go into it, but he's a formidable figure. What does he want, and how much of what he wants is consonant with what a China returning to the world stage wants, even at sort of the subconscious level, the nation, the people? How much is he representing what they actually want, and what is it that they want? Because that determines the last question before we go to questions, which is where's the off-ramp given the realities that you're describing?
So I say in the book, so I am not a China scholar. I've been studying China for the last 10 years, trying to learn about China, but I don't speak Mandarin, I don't read Mandarin. I listen to a lot of China scholars, and I've had a good fortune to be educated by a number of them. The one that had the most impression on me is Lee Kuan Yew. So Lee Kuan Yew was the world's premier China watcher, without any doubt. In the book that I did on Lee Kuan Yew, Henry Kissinger writes the foreword, and he says, this is the smartest guy I ever met. Smartest strategic guy. So Lee Kuan Yew, and he spent thousands of hours with Chinese leaders feeling them because they kept coming to him wanting advice about what to do about China. So every leader of China since Deng Xiaoping, including Xi Jinping, called Lee Kuan Yew mentor, which in China that means you're my guru. We asked this question. Are China's current leaders, including Xi Jinping, serious about displacing the U.S. as the predominant power in Asia in the foreseeable future, like in the horizon? You can read Kissinger's book. It's 700 pages. It says on the one hand, on the other hand, it's complicated. I don't think you can find a China expert, actually, who will answer the question, because they're a little bit afraid. If you answered this question honestly, you probably won't get a visa to go back to China. Okay. But Lee Kuan Yew he's 90 years old, and in any case, he's the mentor. His question, his answer, you can read in the book. He says, of course. Why not? Who could imagine otherwise? How could they not aspire to be number one in Asia and eventually in the world? So what does Xi Jinping want? Long before Trump made Make America Great his moniker, in 2012, Xi Jinping, when he became president, announced colloquially his objective, make China great again. Okay? He calls it the great rejuvenation of the great Chinese people. And the Chinese narrative, and this rings true for every Chinese, and deeply for Xi Jinping, China was great for 5,000 years. Chinese believe the word China even means center of the universe. Everything else is located in relationship to me. I'm at the pinnacle of civilization because Chinese only believe in hierarchical systems. And
is the conduit between heaven and earth. Right?
They're the link between heaven and earth, and everybody else is beneath me, and their relationship with me is reflected in how they kowtow even. So that's how you know who's the...
China had no foreign policy per se, it had tributaries.
Absolutely, they only have relationship with tributaries because that's the only... Nobody else can be Chinese, nobody can be equal to Chinese. Chinese are... There's China, and then there's other people, and other people relate to them with respect, and the respect is what you show by kowtowing and adjusting as a tributary. So in any case, the idea, and they believe that that was the fact of life forever until 200 years ago when Westerners came, intervened, colonized them, exploited them, and once the West gets out of the way, China will be China again. So they just want to be China again. And in the case of Xi Jinping, how do you then justify that I'm going to rule with my gang and the rest of you are going to like it? Okay? Well, for a while it was called the Communist Party. So communism is going to create a new socialist man and blah, blah, blah. That failed. So nobody in China believes in communism. You can find more communists in Cambridge than you can find in China. Okay? But so how to then justify the party? So there, he is now, he's got four big revolutions he's trying to make simultaneously, one of which is to re-legitimize the party as the vanguard. I call them Leninist mandarins in the Chinese Mandarin tradition, people who will be so virtuous and will be so competent that everybody else will say, let them drive the bus, because look how the bus is working fine, they can govern fine, our economy's producing fine, and most importantly, we're becoming more proud every day to be Chinese. So Chinese nationalism is the new ideology that's taken the place of communism, and if you look especially among younger Chinese, in the social media, which is less control, the extent of the nationalism is frightening, actually. I mean, basically frightening. I did one of these radio shows day before yesterday, and a person calls in, a lady from Iowa, and she said, this all sounds so interesting. She said, you know, I'm married to a Chinese man, so we live together. I'm from Iowa and he's from China. And she says, but I noticed that in the last several years, he's becoming more and more proud to be Chinese. And I said, well, and she said, and now he's telling me I should become more Chinese. And so I thought, well, I'm not in the marriage counseling business. Yeah. But I said, well, this is, I think, the hope that we might have people that could see things from both perspectives or whatever, and hope to get under
whatever
the next
gets you
caller.
through the radio show.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the one other one. In the case of the no war, so because I want to be clear that while the book is called Destined for War, Can the U.S. and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Even Paul Volcker was getting after me about this. He said, the subtitle should be How America and China Can Escape Thucydides' Trap. Because this book is not fatalistic about war with China, It's not pessimistic about war with China. So I argue in the book that history as usual, business as usual, if we just do what business as usual, will produce history as usual. And in this case, history will be catastrophic. But there's no reason why we can't learn lessons both from the successes and the failures. And the success story that I think is most instructive is the Cold War case. Yeah.
But you talk in this book about, and you refract much through the Huntington frame, that ultimately culture culture is going to decide whether civilizations are in conflict or not. Major powers are going to be in conflict or not. Great Britain and the U.S. switched places without war, in part because they're so alike. You describe in this book Confucian centralized autocratic system of one country, an American system built on individualism, open party system, freedom of speech, the chaos that comes with Americanness. I disagree with you. I don't think this is that. I think for 184 pages, you take us right to the brink of war and then say, but here are some possible off-ramps. No. It's very compelling. But the off-ramps, in part because of this cultural paradigm that you use, the off-ramps don't seem that compelling. And so my question is, it's with two-part, and then we'll go to questions, is what are the chances? I mean, you already say that the American Navy is very hesitant to move aircraft carriers within a certain number of miles of the Chinese coast because the Chinese have developed aircraft carrier killing missiles that are land-based. You describe a situation in which any number of events could trigger a conflagration in the South China Sea, among other places, Taiwan certainly. What are the most compelling off-ramps you see? And the second piece of the question, and it's going to sound like a little bit of an obvious softball question given the current circumstances, but what do American strategists need to do? What does an American president need to do now to forestall the chance that in 10 years or 5 years, the United States Navy and the Chinese Navy come into open conflict in the South China Sea? And then we'll go to questions. Just small questions for you.
Good. Many big questions. So I have a chapter on Clash of Civilizations in which I contrast the two cultures, and I think Jeff is exactly right that this is not Britain and the U.S. These are two sharply contrasting cultures. Their basic core conceptions of what is order at home and what is order internationally are quite different. One is kind of this, as you say, all human beings are equal, and we've got democracy, and governance is by. The other one is we have a hierarchy, and in the Confucianism, the number one principle is know thy place. And your place is not mine if you're not Chinese. It's, you know, further down on the pole. So I think the cultural piece of this exacerbates the Thucydidean dynamic. The Thucydidean dynamic is about the power relationship. The culture adds to it and makes it extremely more difficult and more complicated. On the off-ramps, I think if we look at the Cold War as an example, it's most people, again, don't hardly remember what was the Cold War, okay? But I have, I think, a good short summary of it in the book. So in 1946, just basically a year after the end of World War II, George Kennan wrote back a famous telegram known to in any diplomacy or history as the Long Telegram. This was April 1946. And he said, the Soviet Union poses for the U.S. today an existential threat larger than the threat posed by Nazism. Well, nobody in Washington wanted to hear, anybody in the U.S. wanted to hear anything about this. Wait a minute, we've just fought a long, bloody war. We're exhausted. We're bringing our troops home, and you're telling me there's another dragon out there that needs my attention. Forget about it. So it started initially, we were hoping maybe this goes away, or maybe Kennan is off in some. Stalin's actions, especially leaving troops in Eastern Europe, came to be seen to validate this. And over time, and over the next 4 years, you had stimulated a huge and very creative discussion in Washington that included people like Kennan, but also George Marshall. So 70 years ago this month, Marshall went to Harvard to give the speech about the Marshall Plan. Think of the idea. You've just been fighting a war. You're exhausted. You've spent a lot of money. And somebody says, I have a new idea. Taxpayers should take some more of their money and send it to Europe, including to rebuild Germany and Japan, who were just killing us less than 2 years ago. People said, that's crazy. Nobody would do this.
It is particularly hard at this moment to imagine an American public keen for that.
But after World War II, the American public was not very keen either. So initially, I mean, if you read the paper about after this, this was like a really cockamamie idea. It was a cockamamie idea. I mean, it was such hugely ambitious. Now, lo and behold, it worked. Okay? How about NATO? George Washington had told us alliances are a bad idea. They entangle you. And especially an alliance in which you commit yourself to fight for somebody else if he's attacked? No, that's very un-American. That's called NATO, 1949. So Truman, Marshall, Acheson, Nitze, when you get to NSC 68, created a strategy for Cold War, and then for basically 4 decades, the U.S. persisted with the strategy for Cold War to victory in the Cold War, to the defeat of the Soviet Union. So in my chart, this counts as no war. It's called war, but that's just metaphor. This was war by every means except bombs and bullets. So thousands of Americans and Soviet combatants were not killing each other. So could you imagine from that, I mean, if you had something,
so
no more imaginative.
Mutually assured destruction might keep us from war with China?
That was part of it. Mutual assured destruction was part of it, but part of it was also in the Soviet case that their system didn't work. If a command and control economy had worked to produce more goods than the capitalism, and the Soviet Union had grown to be bigger than the U.S., which is what John Kennedy thought was going to happen. Indeed, as I point out in the book, nobody today can think of Russia being anything. Paul Samuelson's textbook in economics, which is the only and dominant economic textbook in 1964, says by the end of the 70s, the Soviet Union economy is going to be bigger than the U.S. They had done Sputnik, if you remember, so they looked to be like on a surge. If that had worked, that would have been one thing. Now, how about this? How about the Chinese governance system? Lee Kuan Yew said about it that maybe you can run an authoritarian system of the sort in the old days. But once people have smartphones and are able to communicate with each other and can see what else is going on in the world, that's an outmoded operating system, so that's not going to work. So can the Chinese invent a way to govern themselves with a party and whatever? I don't know. Can we invent a way to govern ourselves? Okay, I don't know. So I would say there's big questions with respect to both of them, but I think if you imagine the surge of imagination no larger than what happened in the creation of the Cold War, there's a lot of ingredients to build on.
We're going to go to a couple of questions. Oh, there's a mic. Okay.
Dr. Allison, John Arundel from Washington Life magazine.
Thank you.
5 years ago, I interviewed Donald Trump out at his golf course out here in Virginia, and I casually mentioned that I was going to Beijing the next week as a guest of the Chinese Foreign Ministry with 2 other Washington Post reporters, and his whole face turned red, and he went off on me for 30 minutes about the evils of China. Finally, when I was able to catch a breath, I said, "Wow, Mr. Trump, why don't you like China?" And he said, "Well, they won't let me build there." So my question for you is his policy towards China, and maybe perhaps is China towards Russia, self-serving?
Okay, a good question. So I know that all of us are fascinated by President Trump and puzzled, and he certainly is the most unusual president that certainly has been seen in my lifetime. And we have a applied history project at Harvard where we've been asking who is Trump like, and I can't find, maybe Andrew Jackson, but when you look at the details, it doesn't quite work. Huey Long is the closest that you could see, and Huey Long was actually a pretty amazing character himself. So this is I agree to be puzzled, and I'm watching very very carefully. I think that the fact that he has not been interested in the world very much previously, other than where he was doing business deals, means that he doesn't have much of a sense for history. The fact that he hasn't been part of the foreign policy or policy-making business means that he's not, he doesn't subscribe to the verities that the foreign policy establishment would. The fact that he's not part of the political class means that he's not confined by the mores of the, as they've evolved in our democracy and in the way that Washington works. Now, we should remember, he was elected by people who think Washington doesn't work. So his constituents basically wanted somebody who was a disruptor and whose main idea was that they were going to drain the swamp, get rid of Washington as a dysfunctional operation, and the elites in the society whom they don't think did much for him either. And this was not simply Trump voters. If you look at what was the energy in the Sanders voters, you have a similar rejection. So I think that's what he comes out of. What could he do? I think it's almost like a blank slate. He could go this way, he could go that way. There's no question that he likes people to like him. So, and maybe he defines himself to some substantial terms that way. One person that I know that knows him said, most people miss him. If you want to have an image of him, think of somebody who can produce and star in a reality TV show. Now, most of us don't even know what is a reality TV show. I forced myself to watch 2 episodes of The Apprentice, and you think, wait a minute, 15 of the 25 most popular TV shows in America today are reality TV shows. So get used to it. That's our constituency. That's our folks. He relates to those folks in a way that we don't.
Let me make a short intervention before we go to that question and ask you about the op-ed written the other day by Gary Cohn and H.R. McMaster, which, if it reflects Donald Trump's thinking, reflects something novel in the way presidents are making policy. They say there is no such thing as a global community, as a community of nations. There's an arena in which countries fight it out over their interests. What does that mean? Again, big essay question, short answer. What does that mean for U.S. relations with China? Or are we so economically interdependent with them that we can't have the conflict that seems to be hinted at in that kind of argument?
Well, I think McMaster, whom I know very well and whom I'm a big fan of, and Cohen, whom I don't know, but I know him, a bit, their proposition is not all that different from a realist internationalist point of view, which is pretty close to my view, which is
But
that
it's awfully transactional, even with allies.
It is transactional, but it starts off from the proposition that we live in a Hobbesian world. So what does that mean? It's like a jungle, and it means there's no adult supervision. So there's only leaders of countries, and they do whatever they can get away with. And as Thucydides taught us in the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. So that's life. And I argue this actually in the book, that in this world there's three possibilities, only three. First, you are prepared to fight and die for your own freedom. That's option one. Two, you find someone else who will fight and die for you. And three, you are ruled by somebody else who will. That's it, the three options. So as we listen to Mrs. Merkel saying, oh, I'm not sure I can...
Actually sounds like the journalism business, by the way.
Well, if you say, I'm not sure I can depend on you anymore, okay? The answer is, I think that's right. You cannot be sure you can depend on us anymore, but I'm telling you there's three options. So what's your other option? You're going to fight for yourself? Absolutely not. Germans not going to fight for themselves. You want to be then ruled by somebody else? No, I don't want to do that. I don't like these three options. Excuse me, that's all there are. 1, 2, 3, you choose which one. So I think they are appreciating what's actually a fact, that because the U.S. has provided a security blanket for countries, it's able to maybe move them a little bit more in ways that would be good for us. And I think that's not an implausible idea. Now, how you then go from there to bilateral trade deficits as the measure of a relationship, I think makes no sense. I mean, economists think make no sense. So there's a lot of, I don't like where they necessarily go with it, but the framework, I don't find that that troubling.
Hello, my name is Will Morris. I'm an intern with Defense One, and I'm also an undergraduate at Harvard. So it's great to meet you, sir. I've heard about you my entire time there, so it's an honor. I studied China very intensively. I studied the language as well, and I'm very concerned about the potential of war between America and China. It's something that, frankly, has kept me up at night sometimes. And I've written some papers on it, and I've sort of identified 4 potential areas of conflict between America and China, and I'd love to hear your opinion on those 4.
Could you make, just because we have to get a bunch of questions
absolutely,
in, so
I'm sorry.
Go with your top one, yeah.
Okay, I guess the top one would be war between America and China on the Korean Peninsula. What would you say the likelihood of that is?
That's a good one. I think that, in the book I have a chapter called From Here to War. I've got 5 scenarios that don't stretch very far, and the Korean one I think is the most plausible one today, and it's extremely dangerous. And I could go on for a long riff on it, but I'll give you the short version. Actually, I had an op-ed in the New York Times, I think yesterday or the day before, giving a little bit of my view. So basically, think about this as a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So on the one hand and then the other. On the one hand, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons. That's a fact already. North Korea has developed missiles that can deliver nuclear warheads to South Korea. That's a fact. North Korea has developed missiles that can deliver a nuclear warhead to Japan. That's a fact. So that's already happened. And North Korea will, in the next year or so, develop ICBMs that can deliver a nuclear warhead against San Francisco or Los Angeles. So that's the one hand. On the other hand, we have President Trump. From the instant he ever heard of this, because he had never heard of this before, President Obama told him in the handoff, I'm leaving for you a big crisis. He tweeted immediately, not going to happen. And every day thereafter, anybody that he has a chance to talk to, he says, this is not going to happen. Under Donald Trump, North Korea will never be able to attack with nuclear weapons San Francisco and Los Angeles. And most Americans would agree that would be a terrible thing if North Korea should come to have such a capability. But so now you have 2 trains going down the track towards a point of collision in the next year. And either Kim Jong-un will stop testing for some reason, unlikely voluntarily, or alternatively, President Trump will decide there's some way to live with this. But if he doesn't, and decides what he said at Mar-a-Lago, he said to Xi Jinping, look, you can solve this problem, China, and you should solve this problem. But I'm telling you, if you don't solve this problem, I'm going to solve this problem. And if I do, you're not going to like it. So if we attack North Korea, which we can easily do, to prevent it testing missiles that would give them an ICBM capability against the U.S. The question is, what happens? And most likely, most intelligence folks think, North Korea will respond by attacking Seoul with artillery and probably kill 1 million people in 24 or 48 hours. And then what happens? Maybe the game's over, or maybe, and I think more likely, South Korea and the U.S. attack all the remaining artillery and missiles in North Korea that could attack South Korea. Otherwise, they may kill 10 million more people. And then the U.S., then we have that's called the Second World War. Second Korean War. And again, most people don't remember. I have a little description of this in the book. What happened in the First Korean War? The First Korean War, 1950, North Korea attacks South Korea, almost captures the whole country. Last minute, U.S. comes to the rescue. MacArthur, who happened to be left in Japan, because the war is just 5 years over, this is 1950, goes with a division, pushes the North Koreans right back up the peninsula, and says he's going to be home for Christmas. As they get close to the Chinese border, the Chinese attack the U.S., 300,000 people, half of them didn't even have shoes, and beat the U.S. right back down the peninsula to the 38th parallel, where the country remains divided today. So will China go to war to prevent the reunification of North Korea under the control of an American military ally? I believe they will. And I think down that path, even though there's not a single person that I've ever seen in China who thinks war with the U.S. is a good idea. And there's not a single person at the Pentagon who believes war with China would be anything other than a catastrophic idea. But just like 1914, a match could be a fire that could be a catastrophe.
If we can just do 2 short questions and short answers, we can get both.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. And then if you ask your question, and then maybe Zal can very quickly ask your question, and then you could take them.
Please.
And by the way, after we finished, Graham has graciously agreed to stay and sign his book for everyone. I don't know where we're doing it, probably out there. But anyway, please go ahead.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. Very quick comment and then a quick question. Comment, I served in the first 2-3 years of the Clinton White House when we inherited a collapsed Soviet Union. So I'd be quite anxious to see how you think the Cold War, the way that ended, could be a way that we can resolve the situation with China. In my mind, it's not clear how we can do it because, of course, their economy basically collapsed. And we know that. Whether that happens with China, we'll see. The question I had is sort of follow the money question. A lot of what permits China to do what it's doing, everything from the One Belt, One Road, the aircraft carriers, all the rest, it's money. Money's accumulated through trade surpluses, huge investment flows. Do you talk at all in the book about the economic component of dealing with the question? And if so, maybe you could summarize.
Right. And could we just run over there and collect the question?
Hi. My question is, if given your prognosis or diagnosis, doesn't that imply that we need to do everything we can to delay, if not prevent, China from catching up and surpassing us? What would a strategy to, say, delay or prevent, what would that imply and what risks would that have? Or is this inevitable regardless of what we do? Because I believe that the rise of China in part has been facilitated by what we have done with them and in the context of our, and a footnote to that, does nuclear, the fact of nuclear weapons changes the relativity of the pre-nuclear age shifts in the balance. That may not be necessarily a predictor. Would you say something on that?
Okay, to try to be brief on both of them. Let me go to I'll take them in order. The first one, because both are great questions and could be a long discussion. But I do have a lengthy discussion of the economic balance of power, because I think economics is basically the substructure of most of this conversation. And actually, I have a chart that I like very much, but that some of my colleagues don't like as much, that I used when I testified once with the Senate Armed Services Committee. So imagine a seesaw. So, and on one end is the US and on the other end is China. And in 1980, China is 10% the size of the U.S., so the seesaw looks like that. In 2014, the seesaw becomes like this, equal. And in 2024, it looks like that. Okay? So that's called economic gravity. And we had a debate about the pivot here in the Obama administration, which was an argument about whether we should put more weight on our left foot in the Middle East, where we were fighting wars, or on our right foot in Asia, where the future is being. But as I point out, all the while, our feet are just sort of lifting off the ground. Okay? So the economic balance of power between China and the U.S. that's occurred over these 30 years, and the economic balance of power, if you do it with every one of China's trading partners, every Asian country, China is their number one source of markets. China is their number one source of investment. China is their dominant economy. So the economic balance of power, as Lee Kuan Yew put it, has become more important on a daily basis than the military balance of power when you're not fighting wars. Now, the military balance of power then becomes decisive in some other cases. On to Zal's point, which is also an excellent point, for most of this period, the U.S. was trying to build up the Chinese economy because this was part of the strategy against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So the purpose of Kissinger and Nixon in helping widen the gap between China and the U.S. and building up the Chinese economy was for that purpose. And actually, that helped a lot. But I argue in the book that basically then comes 1991 and the end of the Cold War, this question, and we basically then took a victory lap and a lapse of strategic thinking, basically either declaring the end of history or the ultimate victory of the rule-based international order with democracies and market economies and otherwise, and basically did not do a strategic reassessment of our situation, because a bigger and stronger China, that is the China that has existed for 5,000 years, will not be comfortable for the U.S. in the environment that we've tried to create in Asia. So we would have had to adjust it in different ways. And I say in the conclusion of the book, this book will make Washingtonians mostly unhappy because I know, having worked in Washington on several occasions, that you have to describe the solution in the same sentence that you describe the problem. So if you can't do that, there's no satisfaction. So it should end with the description of a new strategy that's got a new snappy title, 4 to-do lists, and then take an aspirin and everything's going to turn out well. And I would say, unfortunately, in this case, that's not the description of the problem. The emergence of a 5,000-year-old civilization with 1.4 billion people, I say in the book, is not a problem to be fixed in Washington terms. This is a chronic condition to be coped with over a generation. And I would hope, and what I hope that the book helps do, is stimulate now the beginning of a serious conversation about what a strategy would be for dealing with the China that's as big and strong as it's become. And I think it should be way, way, way outside the box of the current conversation in Washington and in Cambridge. So I would look at, as you'll see in the book, I have one strategy at one end that's way to the left of anything anybody would propose, called accommodation. And I have one way to the right of anything anybody's proposed, which is called undermining and splintering. So I would say, and both of those, I'm not subscribing per se to either of them, but I think in the same way that if you had said, well, how about we think of the Marshall Plan and we get taxpayers to give money to rebuild Europe, or how about you think we get entangled in an alliance of NATO, most sensible people in 1946 would have told you, you're out of your mind. You know, this is not what we do. We just have been through, so forget about it. To which the answer is they did not forget about it. They kept facing the world as it was. They kept struggling with it. They argued and discussed and whatever. And so I'm hoping that over the next period, not too long, and especially, and that's for especially younger people here, I think it's more likely that there's some more creative ideas that come to this conversation from people who are next generation from me and another generation behind them than it is from people that have been kind of caught by the Cold War consensus that was, I think, a very successful strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union, but not for the current situation.
I would tell you to buy the book, but you already have the book. But you can get Graham to sign it right now. And thank you very much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Thanks.